Hello, and welcome to Lyla's Lullabies, where we spend time exploring with Lyla, a traveler who wanders the world at her own pace, while sharing her most enriching and restorative moments with you. In tonight's story, we'll follow Lyla as she explores the beautiful English city of York. There's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to remember. Just settle in, get comfortable, and let yourself go. We're so glad you're here. Whenever you're ready, let's begin. The September morning in York had a softness to it, the light filtering through clouds that threatened rain but hadn't yet delivered. Lyla woke in her small hotel room near the city walls, already hearing the sounds of the ancient city stirring. Footsteps on cobblestones, a delivery van's reversing beeps, the distant call of jackdaws somewhere overhead. She dressed warmly, layering a sweater under her jacket. September in northern England could be unpredictable, and headed downstairs to breakfast. The hotel's dining room was cozy and traditional, with dark wood furniture and windows that looked out onto a narrow medieval street. She helped herself to toast, eggs and strong tea, fortifying herself for a day of exploration. Outside, the air was cool and slightly damp, carrying the scent of old stone and the river Ouse. Her hotel was just a short walk from York Minster, and Lyla made her way through quiet streets that were only beginning to wake up. The buildings here were a mix of timber-framed medieval structures and Georgian brick, many leaning slightly with age, their upper stories overhanging the narrow lanes below. As she turned a corner, York Minster revealed itself in stages, first a glimpse of Gothic pinnacles above the roofline, then more towers, and finally the full magnificent structure, its limestone glowing pale grey in the morning light. The cathedral dominated the skyline, as it had for centuries, a testament to medieval ambition and faith. Lyla approached across Deangate, the minster growing larger with each step. Even having seen photographs, she wasn't quite prepared for the scale of it. The soaring towers, the intricate stonework, the massive stained glass windows that were just beginning to catch the morning light. The great east window alone was the size of a tennis court, she'd read, filled with medieval glass depicting the beginning and end of the world. The doors were just opening for visitors, and Lyla entered into the cool, vast interior. The nave stretched before her, its ceiling so high it seemed to fade into shadow. Stone columns rose like a forest of carved trees, supporting pointed arches that led the eye ever upward. Light filtered through the stained glass, creating pools of color on the stone floor, blues and reds and golds that shifted as clouds moved across the sun outside. She walked slowly through the space, her footsteps echoing softly despite the growing number of other visitors. There was something about the acoustics of these old cathedrals that made every sound feel significant, as if the building itself was listening. The stained glass was extraordinary. Each window told stories, biblical scenes, saints, kings, ordinary medieval people immortalized in colored glass. Lyla stood before the Five Sisters window, 5 tall lancets filled with grisaille glass in shades of gray and green, their patterns geometric and hypnotic. Then the great east window with its intricate panels, the largest expanse of medieval stained glass in Britain. She descended into the undercroft where the cathedral's foundations were exposed, revealing layers of history, Roman columns from the fortress that once stood here, Norman stonework, medieval construction. It was like looking at the city's geological record, each layer telling a different story of York's long past. After spending nearly an hour in the Minster, Lyla emerged back into daylight and crossed into Dean's Park, a green space that wrapped around the cathedral's northern side. The park was peaceful, with well-maintained lawns and mature trees beginning to show their autumn colors. A few people walked dogs or sat on benches reading, and the Minster rose behind them, providing a dramatic backdrop. She found a bench near the medieval city walls that formed one boundary of the park and sat for a while, watching clouds move across the sky, listening to the rustle of leaves and the distant sounds of the city. There was something restorative about these pauses, these moments of simply sitting and observing. From Dean's Park, Lyla walked toward Clifford's Tower, the keep of York's medieval castle perched on its artificial mound. The tower was visible from various points in the city, a distinctive quatrefoil shape rising above the surrounding buildings. She climbed the steps built into the mound's side, the path winding upward through grass that was still damp with morning dew. At the top, the tower's interior was open to the sky. The wooden floors and roof had burned centuries ago, leaving only the stone shell. But the views from the ramparts were spectacular. York spread out in all directions, a jumbled collection of rooftops in various shades of red and grey, church spires puncturing the skyline, the Minster dominant to the north, and the river curving through it all like a silver ribbon. Lyla walked around the ramparts, pausing at each cardinal point to take in the different perspectives. She could see the city walls making their circuit, the modern city beyond trying unsuccessfully to overwhelm the historic core, the Yorkshire countryside stretching away toward the horizon. Descending from Clifford's Tower, she made her way toward the Shambles, one of Europe's best-preserved medieval streets. The street announced itself by narrowing dramatically, the buildings on either side leaning in so close their upper stories nearly touched. The lane was paved with uneven stones that had been worn smooth by centuries of feet, and the timber-framed buildings dated back to the 14th and 15th centuries. The Shambles had originally been a street of butcher shops. Shambles was an old word for slaughterhouses, but now it housed an eclectic mix of shops selling everything from fudge to jewelry to books. Despite the tourist-oriented businesses, the street itself retained its medieval character, the overhanging buildings creating a sense of enclosure that was both claustrophobic and charming. Lyla walked slowly, admiring the craftsmanship of the timber framing, the way the buildings leaned and tilted with age, the narrow passages, snickelways in York dialect, that led off to either side. She peered down one such alley and saw it open into a small courtyard she never would have found otherwise, with a cafe tucked into a former stable building. About halfway down the Shambles, she found a bookshop that immediately captured her attention. The shop occupied the ground floor of a particularly crooked building, its doorway so low she had to duck slightly to enter. Inside, the space was wonderfully cluttered, with books stacked on shelves that followed the building's slanted walls, creating angles that would be impossible in a modern structure. The smell of old paper and leather bindings filled the air, and classical music played softly from a radio somewhere. An older gentleman sat behind the counter, reading what looked like a poetry collection through half-moon spectacles. He glanced up as Lyla entered, nodded in greeting, and returned to his book. Lyla began browsing, drawn to a section on local history. She pulled out a volume on the Vikings in York, Georgic they'd called it, and began flipping through illustrations of archaeological finds and reconstructed buildings. "That's a good one," a voice said beside her. She turned to find a woman about her age also browsing the history section. "Very thorough on the Viking settlement." "I'm a bit obsessed with that period, I'm afraid." "It's fascinating," Lyla agreed. "I didn't realize how significant York was to the Vikings until I started reading about it." "Oh yes, second only to Dublin for Viking Britain," the woman said enthusiastically. "There's a marvelous museum, Jorvik Viking Centre, if you've time. They've recreated the streets based on the archaeological digs. You can even smell what Viking York would have smelled like, for better or worse," she laughed. They chatted for a few minutes about the city's history, the woman recommending other sites Lyla might enjoy. Another customer joined their conversation, an elderly man who'd been browsing the poetry section and had opinions about the best medieval churches to visit in York Street. "Martin le Grand is criminally overlooked," he insisted. "Right in the middle of Coney Street, and people walk past it every day without a second glance. 15th century glass you won't believe." The bookshop owner eventually joined in from his position at the counter, adding his own recommendations without ever getting up from his stool. It was the kind of organic conversation that could only happen in independent bookshops, where strangers bonded over shared interests, and the proprietor served as both host and moderator. Lyla ended up buying the Viking history book and a slim volume of Yorkshire poetry the owner recommended. He wrapped them carefully in brown paper, tying the parcel with string in a way that felt wonderfully old-fashioned. "Enjoy York," he said as she prepared to leave. "Not many places left like it, are there?" "Not many," Lyla agreed. Back on the Shambles, the street had grown busier with late-morning visitors, but Lyla didn't mind. She continued to the end of the street and found herself in a small square where several lanes converged. A church, one of York's many medieval churches, stood at one corner, its tower square and sturdy, built to last. It was nearing lunchtime, and Lyla found a pub on a quiet side street that looked promising. Dark wood exterior, hanging baskets of flowers, a menu board advertising traditional Yorkshire fare. Inside, the pub was cozy and dimly lit, with low-beamed ceilings and a fireplace where a small fire crackled despite it being September. She ordered fish and chips and a half-pint of local ale, claiming a seat near a window that looked out onto the street. The food arrived quickly, the fish in crispy golden batter, the chips thick and proper, mushy peas on the side, a wedge of lemon. It was exactly what pub food should be, hearty and satisfying, the kind of meal that felt right on a cool English day. As she ate, she watched people pass by the window. Tourists consulting maps, locals hurrying about their business, a tour group following a guide dressed in Victorian costume. The ale was smooth and malty, the perfect complement to the meal. After lunch, Lyla made her way to the puzzling world of Professor Kettlestring, an interactive museum dedicated to puzzles, optical illusions, and curiosities. The museum occupied a Georgian building near the river, its facade elegant and unassuming, giving no hint of the playful interior. Inside was a wonderland of puzzles and interactive exhibits. There were mechanical puzzles to solve, optical illusions that made her question what she was seeing, a room where the laws of perspective seemed reversed, making it impossible to judge size and distance. There were historical puzzles and games, brain teasers, mathematical curiosities, and a collection of puzzle boxes that required cleverness to open. Lyla moved through the exhibits at her own pace, trying her hand at various challenges, laughing at herself when optical illusions fooled her completely, delighting when she managed to solve a particularly tricky mechanical puzzle. There was something wonderfully absorbing about it all, the way the puzzles demanded complete attention, leaving no room for anything else. Other visitors were equally engrossed, a father and daughter working together on a logic puzzle, a couple arguing good-naturedly about the solution to a brain teaser, a solo visitor like herself methodically working through each exhibit. She spent longer than planned in the museum, drawn from one puzzle to the next, her mind pleasantly engaged in ways it hadn't been in a while. When she finally emerged, blinking in the daylight, she felt both mentally stimulated and oddly relaxed, the way one does after focused concentration. The afternoon was progressing toward evening, and Lyla decided to spend some time in the Yorkshire Museum Gardens, a botanical garden that wrapped around the ruins of St. Mary's Abbey. The gardens were just a short walk from the museum, and she entered through the main gate, immediately feeling the shift from the busy streets to this green oasis. The gardens were beautifully maintained, with winding paths leading through different planted areas. A Victorian garden, a woodland section, areas dedicated to specific plant families. But the real highlight was the Abbey ruins, the medieval stonework rising dramatically from the lawn, Gothic arches open to the sky, walls that had once enclosed a powerful Benedictine monastery. Lyla found a bench near the ruins and sat down, content to rest after her day of exploration. The gardens were quiet, with just a few other visitors scattered about, someone sketching the ruins, an elderly couple walking slowly along the paths, a woman reading on a blanket spread on the grass. Squirrels chased each other up and down trees, and birds sang from the branches overhead. The Abbey ruins stood silent and dignified, their stones warm in the afternoon light, ivy climbing their walls, grass growing where altar and choir stalls once stood. She sat there for nearly an hour, not thinking about anything in particular, just letting the peaceful atmosphere wash over her. There was no need to rush, no agenda to keep. This was what she'd come for. These moments of quiet observation, of being present in a beautiful place, with no demands beyond simply being there. Eventually, she stirred herself and made her way toward the river, where she took a short cruise on the Ouse. The boat departed from King's Staithe, a landing near the city centre, and Lyla arrived just as the vessel was preparing to board. The boat was modest but comfortable, with both indoor seating and an outdoor deck. Lyla chose to sit outside, despite the cooling air, wanting the full experience of being on the river. Other passengers settled around her, a family with children, several couples, a group of friends celebrating someone's birthday. The boat pulled away from the landing with a gentle rumble of engines, and they began moving upstream, the city revealing itself from this new perspective. Buildings that had seemed ordinary from street level showed their full character from the river. Warehouses converted to apartments, old mills, Georgian townhouses, with gardens sloping down to the water's edge. The boat passed under Lendal Bridge, its iron arches spanning the river gracefully, then Ouse Bridge, the city's oldest crossing point. The guide provided commentary about the buildings and history, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of floods and festivals, and the river's importance to York's development as a trading centre. They cruised past the city walls, visible from the river as a stone boundary between the historic center and the newer developments beyond. Swans glided alongside the boat, unconcerned by its presence, and ducks paddled in the quieter eddies near the banks. The perspective from the river was soothing, the gentle motion of the boat, the ever-changing views, the sound of water against the hull. Lyla let herself relax completely, watching the city slide past, listening to the guide's stories without trying to remember every detail, just absorbing the experience. When the boat returned to the landing, the afternoon was fading toward evening. Lyla disembarked and made her way to the city walls, intending to walk a section before the light failed completely. The walls were accessible at several points, and she climbed the stone steps near Bootham Bar, one of the main medieval gates. The wall-top path was narrow, just wide enough for two people to pass each other carefully. To one side, the city centre spread out below, rooftops and gardens, church spires and chimney pots. To the other, the suburbs and countryside beyond. The wall itself was ancient, though much restored over the centuries, its foundations laid by the Romans, built higher by the Normans, maintained and modified through medieval times and beyond. Lyla walked slowly, pausing frequently to take in the views or to examine details of the wall's construction. The stone was weathered and worn, and in places, you could see where different periods of building met and overlapped. The wall had defended the city, defined its boundaries, witnessed sieges and celebrations, and the daily passage of countless ordinary lives. Other walkers shared the path, local joggers who clearly used the walls as a running route, tourists taking evening photographs, couples out for a stroll. Everyone moved at their own pace, and there was an unspoken etiquette about stepping aside to let others pass, about pausing at the wider sections to allow traffic to flow. The light was fading now, the sky turning soft shades of pink and gray. Streetlights were beginning to flicker on below, and windows glowed warm in the buildings on either side of the wall. York was settling into its evening rhythm, and from up here, Lyla could see it all. The Minster's towers silhouetted against the sky, the winding streets of the medieval centre, the river reflecting the last light of day. She walked as far as Monk Bar, another medieval gateway, then descended the steps and found herself back at street level. The city felt different now, the day's energy giving way to evening's calm. Shops were closing, restaurants were opening, people were heading home or heading out for the night. Lyla walked back toward her hotel through streets that were becoming familiar, past the Shambles and Clifford's Tower and the Minster, all of them transformed by the twilight and the warm glow of street lamps. She thought about the day, the soaring Gothic beauty of the Minster, the view from Clifford's Tower, the medieval character of the Shambles, the conversation in the bookshop, the playful engagement of the puzzle museum, the peaceful hour in the abbey gardens, the river cruise's gentle perspective, and the wall walk with its layers of history literally beneath her feet. York had revealed itself as a city where the past wasn't preserved in amber but continued to live and breathe alongside the present. The medieval streets still functioned, the ancient walls still defined the city's heart, the Minster still served its spiritual purpose while also being a tourist attraction and architectural marvel. She found a small cafe that was still open and went inside, ordering a pot of tea and sitting near the window. The cafe was quiet, with just a few other customers, someone working on a laptop, two friends chatting over coffee, an older gentleman reading a newspaper. The tea arrived in a proper pot with a cup and saucer, a small jug of milk, a bowl of sugar cubes. Lyla poured herself a cup and wrapped her hands around it, feeling the warmth seep into her fingers. Through the window, she watched evening deepen into night, the street outside growing quieter, the sky darkening to a deep blue-black. She thought about the bookshop owner's comment, "Not many places left like York." It was true. The city had managed to preserve its character without becoming a museum, to honor its history while remaining a living, working city. There was a continuity here that felt rare and precious, a sense that the present was just the latest layer in a long, ongoing story. The tea was strong and comforting, and Lyla drank it slowly, in no hurry to finish or to leave. The day had been full but never rushed, busy but never frantic. York had offered her exactly what she'd hoped for. History and beauty, yes, but also peace and space for contemplation, for wandering without purpose, for discovering small moments of connection and quiet joy. Outside, York continued its evening. People passing by the cafe window, their conversations muffled by the glass, the occasional car driving carefully along the narrow street, the distant sound of church bells marking the hour. And Lyla sat in the warm cafe, her hands wrapped around her teacup, feeling the pleasant tiredness that comes from a day well spent, grateful for this city and its generous sharing of its long, layered past.